On my birthday, I was involved in a car accident and was trapped in the car with my husband's first love. My doctor husband sprinted to the scene and decided to save the trembling her first. She replied he was far, far away, and that I should wait and be patient, an impatient, cold reply to a man with his blood smeared on him and his assegator looking back at me stuck in the deformed seat. She's pregnant. There are 2 lives at stake. Are you really not seeing this issue at all? His heroism, in saving her, was later captured by someone on the scene and quickly posted online. While his friends all helped themselves to countless blessings, the video was my pain and was laughing at me. You will not be so small as to taunt, Margaret, will you? Smiling impassively, I held the miscarriage notice in my hand, newly off the operating table. No, I won't. After all, I don't plan on keeping either this marriage or Bruno Lu. Let her have it. Chapter 1. The second the anesthesia faded away, pain hit like a tsunami. Because of the horrible pain in my chest, I could not even bear. In the hospital bed, I am pale, my body trembling like the leaf of a tree under a storm. A video kept looping on my phone in front of me at the scene of a car accident. Rescue came just in the nick of time. In the haze of the fireworks, all they could see were each other's eyes, their hungry stares melting into each other, beautiful and picturesque. The comment section was inundated. A hero rescuing a damsel brought to the real. So sweet. The kind of look you never forget. Definitely true love. Crying. A handsome avatar of a man and a beautiful woman. Together they must be locked with a lock. I'll swallow the key. Everyone said they were a perfect match. Except if that hero wasn't my husband, Bruno. Of course, as long as I were not the unconscious one at the accident scene, I could have simply wished God be with him straight away. Keep pulling the progress bar self-destructively. I did my best to hold it together, but that only meant trying not to cry and failing miserably. Today is my birthday. Bruno was going to celebrate it with me, and Camille just said, "Bruno, my belly hurts a little bit," and without thinking twice he turned around to save her to run to the hospital on time. He slammed the accelerator down in anxiety until halfway they crashed because Bruno had kept him safe. Camille was only frightened. I, on the other hand, slammed to the car door as he spun with a high center of gravity and was wedged in the crushed back seat, immobilized. I suddenly bled heavily from below and fainted from the acute pain in my lower abdomen. When I found it hard to cry for his help, they coldly met my difficulty. Millie is pregnant. 2 lives. Margaret, can you not be more sensible now? Covered in blood. I was thunderstruck. It was like a heavy hammer hit my head and blanked it out. Through my blurred vision, he ran straight toward Camille, without glancing back. I heard him tell her not to panic, that he was there. His voice was soft and tremulous. He feared Camille might become injured smelling the disgusting gasoline. I completely passed out. Fortunately, I made it, but at a steep price. Rubbing my sore lower belly gently, I turned off the looping video briefly with a self-deprecating smile. It felt pointless, prodded again at night by the pain. I stood up to ask for some painkillers, though I wasn't sure which kind, but I ran into Bruno in the corridor, which was crazy because it was after working hours. He was still wearing his white coat, the hem askew, and his face haggard. I asked him calmly, "Were you with Camille?" Bruno stared at me blankly. "Margaret, don't waste my time with your crap." He said it so calmly and steadily without a hint of guilt to lie, but he could not hide the strong fragrance of gardenia all over him. It was Camille's signature perfume. How close must they have gotten for the scent to stick so tenaciously? I looked at Bruno, and suddenly there was no emotion. "Let's get a divorce." "Margaret, what are you squealing about now?" Bruno's face changed. He said impatiently, "Only because I didn't celebrate your birthday." I did not answer, but he appeared to take it for granted, the corners of his lips upturning into a frozen smile. "Millie is finding it hard at the moment, as a friend, to cope with the pregnancy." "What are you gonna do? I can't take care of her a bit more." "You are petty as fuck and dramatic as hell. Simply incorrigible." Bruno was about to continue chiding when his phone rang out of the blue. His stern face melted at once. No need to guess. It has to be Camille up against his old first love. Bruno never shied away from displaying a little affection. He hung up and blurted out a sentence. "I've been really busy lately. We can celebrate your birthday some other time." Then he walked away in long strides. Bruno was always like this. He would shower me with a sweet treat every time he left me for Camille as an apology. He didn't see the pale gown, the "it's all four of us out here" gown. No concern, no worry, not a fucking peep. Even though I almost died before him, not the tiniest inkling of guilt. Camille filled his mind and eyes. I was living in a perfect illusion, entangling myself in a cocoon of lies, but not anymore. I raised my hand to scrub the goosebumps off my face, and I really no longer felt sadness. Chapter 2. If I said it, no one would believe it. Bruno was the one who pursued me to begin with. Our common hobbies brought us together on a blind date. Later, we talked in depth, and we realized that our parents were friends for a long time. But it was only natural that we would traverse the halls of marriage. I knew that he had a first love, and they were together for 7 years, but we were all adults. I thought he would deal with everything just fine. Yet I was too naive. My life turned upside down since Camille returned to the country pregnant. Bruno was never calm and self-possessed ever again. When I had a high fever, he took Camille out into the countryside to watch the stars. On our wedding anniversary, he went to Camille's house to do plumbing, leaving me alone in a deserted restaurant. If I expressed the slightest complaint, it was taken as ugly proof of envy, as if, once I became his wife, I was second best. But the tragedies and resentments that are still to come are no longer related to me, she said, signing out of WeChat. I noticed a text from the research director. She was also once again encouraging me to study further abroad. In fact, she told me as much 6 months previously. Then, I bowed out politely because all those 2 years, and because I couldn't bear to leave Bruno behind. I just wanted to live a modest and peaceful life with him. But such a small wish Bruno could not grant me. I summoned all my courage and dialed the direct line to the director. Director, son. I just wanted to ask if that overseas training opportunity we discussed is still available. Maggie, have you finally worked it out? That's amazing, said director's son, stunned and happily shouted, implying, of course, that I've saved a spot just for you. Less than a month to go. Can you get ready in time? I quickly logged on to schedule an online appointment to file for divorce. Do not worry. This time everything is on schedule. It's enough to get a divorce. Chapter 3 the following day, I loaded up my things and called a cab home. And by the time I arrived back, I was fatigued. I walked into the guest room, pulled the covers back, and went out like a light. The knocking noise woke me up. Margaret. It was Bruno's voice unrepeatingly. It was a sense of urgent annoyance, the noise unendurable. I dragged myself to go and unlocked the outside door. Bruno was staring at me with angry reproach. Why was he suddenly so angry? I didn't understand. I said, sorry, I was exhausted and didn't hear you. You got discharged, why you no call me? Bruno said, with his brows heavily furrowed. I was quite surprised. No need to bug you for something so trivial. A car wreck injury is trivial? Bruno stared at me with reproachful eyes. Margaret, you were hurting yourself purposefully to hurt me? How could you be so irresponsible? Being scolded for no reason. I would have definitely argued with Bruno in the past, but this time I remained calm and serene with a smile. You're overthinking. The doctor said I had recovered well and discharged me. Thanks for your concern. I was polite but cool towards them. Bruno was stunned. Just as he was about to speak, a woman's flirtatious voice rang out behind him. Margaret, you're home. Why didn't you tell me? Camille came out in the early morning in her cool camisole nightdresses, looking perfectly relaxed, as if she was mistress of the house. I glanced at Bruno instinctively. He rubbed his nose, unusually uneasy. Millie's house had developed a sudden leak, and being pregnant, I couldn't leave her home alone. Pregnant women actually require special treatment. I understand. For a moment Bruno was speechless. I smiled at him. Margaret, you're not angry? I chuckled. It's normal to help friends, especially since she can't be alone at the moment, and you're a doctor. It's your expertise. On hearing this, Camille covered her mouth with her hand and Bruno looked as if he could hardly believe it. I waited a while. As I turned to go back to sleep, seeing him still standing there, Bruno reached out and grabbed my hand, however. No, Margaret. I know you must be angry. Now it was my turn to be shocked. I observed Bruno purse his lips. And you didn't even respond like this earlier. Because all I could remember was what once had been. He would go to her whenever Camille called, regardless of the hour. We argued about this endlessly. I had wept, I had raged, and I had moaned, had even clawed his face like a hysterical djinn, and he had been unmoved. He would even scold me back. Everything is dirty for a person with a dirty heart. But now with these two again, I felt no emotion whatsoever. I didn't love him anymore. Of course I did not, so I graciously withdrew my hand. It's late. Don't overthink it. Bruno looked at his hand, froze in midair. Ah, Bruno, now my stomach hurts. Suddenly, Camille clasped her belly, her eyes bright red, and teetering as if she might pass out at any second. Millie, Bruno shouted, his brows laced with worry. He happily cradled her in his arms and turned to glare at me. Margaret, I thought if you moved that you would change, but I was wrong. This is someone being petty with a pregnant woman. Aren't you afraid of karma? He stormed off with Camille with a bang and banged the door. This had happened before many times, but now I felt no disturbance in my heart. I went into the kitchen, made a late-night snack, ate too much, and couldn't sleep. Lying in bed fiddling with my phone and accidentally saw Camille's post from 3 minutes ago at the hospital. She fondly leaned against Bruno's shoulder. Bruno lowered his head a little as his delicate fingers ran tenderly across her protruding belly. The caption read, "Bruno will make the best dad in the world." That bar was loud with the comments. Most were mutual friends of Bruno and Camille. Some tagged me just to annoy me. I stared down at my flat stomach, a smile of self-mockery on my lips. I tapped lightly at the screen and typed, "Congratulations on getting what you wished for." Chapter 4. Bruno didn't come home in the days that followed. I welcomed the stillness, and I focused on my recovery. Meanwhile, I called a lawyer and had a divorce settlement agreement written. Before I knew it, it was time for my follow-up appointment at the hospital. I had no idea I was going to bump into Bruno. The instant he saw me, his expression went icy. That post on Millie's WeChat, just a joke. You were getting on her nerves, and pregnant women are very sensitive. If she and the baby come to harm somehow, are you responsible? If she and the baby were to suddenly suffer, Bruno told me. Memories I tried to suppress surfaced. The car wreck, the blood, the unconsciousness, the sympathetic glance from the doctor at the operating table, the form I made myself sign for the induced labor. I stood still, my heart ripping apart in giant hands, the pain blooming enough to silence me. Bruno took my hand and made it clear I was his now. You need to go to Millie today and apologize and ask for her forgiveness. I had been resting for several days, but I had the weakness and fatigue from the miscarriage caused by the car accident. Bruno literally dragged me into Camille's hospital room. It was crowded with people. The moment they saw me, their faces soured. They were the same people in the comment section that day. As soon as Camille walked into the room, she said she would like to eat mangoes. Bruno's hands were still in motion. He usually didn't enjoy fruit, and as a doctor, he had particular standards for his hands. I remembered one time when I was on my period, I called him to make me a bowl of brown sugar water, but he coldly refused. Margaret, I'm a doctor. My hands are very precious. Can't you order takeout? But at this moment, he let the gloppy sweet juice pool on his hands, taking his time peeling a whole plate of mangoes for Camille. It was treatment I had never experienced. The mocking looks cast in my direction became more pronounced. Seeing all this, I did my best to remain stoic. We were getting divorced. It had nothing to do with me. Come on, Camille, as if suddenly realizing teased Bruno. Bruno, you're so good to me. Margaret's gotta be dying with envy. Bruno paused his task, looked in my direction with purpose, and sneered. Aren't you a big boy? Can't you do it yourself without my leading you by the hand? A mango from the fruit basket then flew through the air to me. I grabbed it instinctively and set it next to me on the side table. Bruno seemed momentarily shocked at what I'd just had done. I knew the source of his surprise. He'd offered me an out, and I didn't gratefully take it. Someone rolled their eyes. Oh, she has the strategy, knows when to step back to advance. What a tactic! Bruno's stony expression softened inexplicably a fraction of iota at that. He peeled fruit for Camille still, but his eyes kept returning to mine, as if looking to take a snapshot of me losing my shit. But I remained indifferent. He was staring out the window under the harsh lighting, his face darkening slightly upon seeing this. Camille's eyes welled with tears as she tentatively told Margaret, if you don't mind, you can take all of these mangoes. Her sad display made me seem like the bad guy. That was Camille's standard petty play. She was purposely trying to provoke me, waiting for Bruno to reprimand me, but I didn't care anymore. I smiled quietly, stood up, and was about to leave, but Bruno suddenly stood up to block my way, frowning at me. Margaret, why are you not angry? What are you talking about? I looked at him in confusion. He looked a little frantic as he looked around. I am taking such good care of Millie. Doesn't it bother you? I replied politely. You're friends. I think it's reasonable to care for one another. No, it's not reasonable. Bruno tightened his lips, the corners of his eyes reddening. Why are you ignoring me? Not getting jealous? You weren't like this before. Next to us. Camille's face nearly cracked. What are you talking about, Bruno? Bruno shouted at Camille, uncharacteristically telling her to shut up. Everyone was stunned. Even I was somewhat dazed. A panicky restlessness, like this kind of anxiety. It used to be me. The commotion attracted the ward doctor. He looked somewhat familiar. He was the doctor who had cared for me in an emergency at the time. It was only after entering, he first asked me with concern, Miss Gu, how have you been? Any more vaginal bleeding? I hadn't gotten to say anything. Vaginal bleeding. Margaret, do you have any disease of some kind? Oh, should I not have asked? Camille exclaimed in shock. She appeared shocked and innocent, but her eyes were filled with malice. It was even heard outside the room by passers-by. Phases aimed at me reeked of mockery and unabashed humiliation. A normal phenomenon, but the next moment, the vaginal bleeding in women is not pathological. If you do not understand, then please, shut up and stop misleading people. The doctor chastised Camille, then turned reproachfully to Bruno. Lu, your wife just died of a miscarriage from a car accident. Her body is weak. How can you, as her husband, get angry with her? Chapter 5. The ward doctor was short-lived, though. He walked out of the room after a couple of reprimands. But even a full 5 minutes later, the room was deathly silent. Everyone's eyes kept flitting back and forth between Bruno and me, but no one would say anything. At last, Bruno was the first to speak. You were pregnant and lost the baby. Margaret, why didn't you let me know? There was no need. I could handle it myself. His look was one of shock and anger, and I dismissed it lightly. That little life was gone. There was no reason to say anything else. Looking at me as if I was indifferent, Bruno suddenly got mad. Margaret, that was also my child. How can you say it wasn't needed? His voice came out hoarse, his expression one of disbelief. I sneered at his red-rimmed eyes. Are those crocodile tears? But I hadn't meant to bring up the child. Our marriage was one that could not be saved, and a child was not going to change that. I didn't want this child to be disturbed or be a topic of discussion in a failed relationship. But Bruno, you did this to yourself. I have the capacity to slash you with words. Have you sampled the hurt I felt? When the car crash happened, you had been there. I was on a floor in a pool of blood, my knees filled with glass, begging you to save me. Bruno, what were you doing? I subtly smiled with seeing Bruno teary eyes. Oh, I recall you rescued Camille, who was physically unharmed and only a bit frightened. You chose me and now you blame me? On the other hand, just, zooming out, Camille is pregnant. Well, if you're willing, getting called dad by more people would be a blessing, no? Bruno was dumbfounded, his entire body shaking, his hands curled into fists. Then, all of a sudden, Camille just went, Margaret, I never thought you would have to go through something so like this. I am a mother myself, and I know the pain of losing a child. You must be so sad about your miscarriage. What do we have here? She softly caressed her prominent belly, a faux sympathetic look covering an obvious smirk in return. How about you be the godmother of my baby? Bruno loves this baby so much. He gets too worried if you treat this child as your own whenever I feel uncomfortable. It might bomb your own loss of yours. I knew Camille was shameless, but not this foul. Her words awoke a long, slumbering rage. I walked to her bed, threw up my arm and smacked her well. Caught off guard. She staggered onto the bed, cradling her face in disbelief. I would repeat you, because you won't even lay on an egg unless it's cracked. Bruno couldn't help himself. I do not teach the wives or the mistresses. You continue to provoke me in a juvenile way, but you shouldn't have insulted my child. If it comes again, it won't be settled with just a slap. I grinned, then picked up the plate of mangoes, walking up to Bruno, lifting my wrist. I eased the plate, so the fruit poured onto Bruno. His neatly white coat was dirty in an instant. Do you know why I did not take the mango? I cleared the ridicule from my eyes and addressed Bruno, enunciating every word, because I was allergic to it. On our first date, I had a reaction in front of you. If you can't even remember what your wife eats, don't pretend to care, and you can't help but relish the sight of his suddenly pale face. I laughed heartily. Quit your hypocritical nonsense, Dr. Lu. 6 before leaving. I nonchalantly left the divorce papers, and then I attended my follow-up appointment. Bruno, surprisingly obstinate, insisted to come with me. I don't accept the divorce. I'm your husband, Margaret. I have that right that I made no effort to argue with him, focusing on my health instead. The attending doctor said I was recovering well after the examination. Bruno sighed with relief upon hearing this. With a look of relief, he offered, and picked up the tab and the medicines. I watched coldly. I wasn't going to turn down free work, even if I was about to order a cab home. He insisted on driving me. Maggie, considering your situation, I'm worried. He looked warily at me, as if I were a brittle porcelain doll that should be handled carefully. Before I could say anything, though, an older woman jogged past on the sidewalk and suddenly shouted at him, Dr. Lu, it really is you. Dr. Lu. She looked to Bruno expectantly, at seeing Bruno's surprised look. Don't you remember me? I was the patient of yours whose wife was pregnant and recently admitted. I was sleeping in the bed beside hers. Oh my! For all the years of a great blue sky, I never knew a man like you, Dr. Lu. You always made time for your wife, even with your busy schedule. Preparing her tea, rubbing her cramping legs. It made me so envious. When my daughter eventually marries, I can only hope that someone as considerate as you is her husband. The lady rambled on. Bruno was knocked out at first. Then he eyed me in alarm. His face was terrified and anxious. I listened calmly. The lady, after chatting for an exhaustive 5 minutes, finally noticed me standing there and feeling the weight of Bruno's meticulous care for Camille. Oh, is this one of your patients? Oh, I'm so sorry I'm holding you up. I smiled but said nothing. And Bruno I had no interest in hanging on to, and we'd be strangers soon after the divorce. But for some unfathomable reason, Bruno took my hand, telling the lady earnestly, No, this is my wife. Oh, your wife. Wait, your wife. The look on the lady's face went from shock to distaste. Quickly, her look at Bruno turned to contempt. She spat a well-timed parting shot over her shoulder as she walked out, a forced smile on her face. Having a wife but constantly being in the company of a pregnant female. He is bad, but he is worse than a beast. There are cheaters like him everywhere. It's so disgusting. Oh my God, what did I explain that wrong? My daughter is surely going to find a good man, just not like this. A guy was unable to comprehend Bruno's actions. Why is he giving himself trouble? Was he insane? Yet he remained adamant on personally driving me home. You just had a miscarriage. You must care for your body, or you will long-term damage. Noticing his serious demeanor, I casually replied yes. Whatever. A free driver is a free driver. Bruno asked me to wait at the hospital entry while he got the car from the lot. He held my hand tight before he left. Wait for me 5 minutes, okay? There was a trace of pleading in his normally cold eyes. Okay, but 10 minutes later of waiting, there were no signs of Bruno or his car. I looked down, opened the ride-hailing app on my phone. 15 minutes later, I was home safe, drinking a cup of warm milk. The door opened again. Bruno was at the door, a mess. He pressed his lips together tightly and glanced at me just one more time. Margaret, why didn't you wait for me? Chapter 7. Why didn't I wait for him? Good question. I flipped through the documents in my hand. I didn't look up. I did wait. You succeeded. You were late and broke your promise. Only it takes some time more. You visited Camille, sure? I cut him off abruptly. Don't bother denying it. Here's her lipstick on your collar. The mark was especially conspicuous. A blatant provocation. Camille had set the stage. It would be a shame not to go through with her plan. Millie suddenly fainted, and I worried that something might happen to her. Panic decorated Bruno's face unmistakably. There is absolutely nothing between us. You misunderstood. His hoarse voice held a suggestion of vaguely detectable grievance, as though I had given him grave cause for trouble. But I was the one who was actually hurting. I laughed bitterly, overcome with indescribable rage. You feel aggrieved over such a trivial thing. But Bruno, the hurt you have caused me is far worse than this. When we got married, you made a tearful vow to keep me happy for the rest of our lives without crying. But the truth is, you brought all the pain and shame I have suffered. You volunteered to pick me up 2 months couple ago in the heavy rain. But half a mile out, Camille called, and you left me on the side of the road. I walked for 2 hours in the rain, got a bacterial infection, and ended up in the hospital. A month ago, I experienced a local riot during a business trip. I was so scared. I flew the earliest flight, for 14 hours, to see you, to find you hugged Camille for her birthday song a week ago. I was gargling with my blood, pleading with you to save me and our baby. I was so desperate, and what did I get in return? Took Camille and climbed into the ambulance without looking back. Not even a word of concern. Had it not been for firefighters arriving in time, I would have died in that gasoline-soaked inferno, offering no chance for me to hear your petty grievances. Come on, it's not who I am. All I could do was yell at Bruno. Tell me, Bruno, what right have you to complain to me? Bruno was still. His lips moved and he stammered, but no words came out. I breathed in deeply and prepared to depart. But suddenly, Bruno caught my wrist. Margaret, I was wrong. You or shit you can slay me or scold me. But please, don't divorce me. I did not know you were pregnant when the car accident happened. I figured it was just a little thing. We can always have more kids later on. I'll take good care of you. Just maybe give me a chance to recover from that. Please. I replied with a slap full of all my hatred. Bruno, you're a real scumbag. I laughed sneeringly, my face soaked in tears. So you still have not seen my medical records now. And if you had, you'd know I was bleeding profusely when you logged off on me. This was immediately after I got on the operating table to save my life when I went into cardiac arrest. The doctors ended up having to replace almost all my blood and even take my uterus out. And then you hypocritically tell me we can have more children. How am I to reproduce a child with each of my accusatory words? Bruno's face became increasingly panicked. By the end, he appeared completely shattered. I mocked, pale as a sheet. If you are genuinely remorseful, make sure to sign the divorce papers quickly and provide me with a significantly larger sum in the settlement. With those words, I could not give less a toss as to how Bruno reacts. I went upstairs to rest. Chapter 8. But Bruno didn't seem to want to quit, no matter how many times I told him. He still didn't sign the divorce papers. He began claiming my daily meals. He would follow me around, bringing me a bouquet of fresh roses every morning. He was a shadow I wasn't able to shed. After 2 or 3 days of this, I couldn't stand it anymore. Bruno, is this significant to you? My face was cold, my voice tinged with irritation. You're disturbing my life. Doctors nowadays are so free, are they? Bruno closed his lips and smiled bitterly. I've been suspended from the hospital. Someone submitted an anonymous complaint, alleging that Bruno had inappropriate relationships with patients. Also, his having favored Camille at the hospital was revealed, prompting his suspension, an investigation, one mistake, and after all these years, it could all come tumbling down. None of this was any of my concern, though. So it was Bruno who smiled forced, then now at my calm and unruffled gaze. I just want to do right by you. Fine, I will give you that opportunity. Really? Bruno's eyes briefly glimmered with hope. Then he gave way to despair. Sign the divorce papers. I callously exploded his fantasies. If you won't, after 2 years apart, can I file for divorce? I had suffered deeply blinded by love. Now I finally had my head straight. Nothing could hold me back from moving forward. Margaret, I know that I did great harm to you in the past, but I finally understand what I did. How do you not give me an opportunity to make it right? Bruno gazed at me hopelessly, full of regret in his eyes. I looked at him blankly. Can I have my baby back, please? Chapter 9. After enduring the abortion. I thought I was strong enough to hold on, he said, but every night, in the silence of the night, there was always the sound of a child crying, echoing in my ears. I'd wake from nightmares one after another, soaking my pillow with my tears. Logically, I kept telling myself, the best decision we made was to lose the baby. This child came too suddenly. I knew that future was not in my relationship with Bruno. It wouldn't be fair to him to rashly bring him into a loveless family. And this was a child lost to an accident. I wouldn't have the guilt of having killed him myself. But the collapsing and sobbing was all too real. All those sleepless nights had been real time. The numerous contributions I made to temples for longevity lamps were not an obstacle either. Even with all my self-deceiving, I could not forgive myself. I felt like an unfit mother, disgusted with myself for losing a life because of my irresponsibility. But before I get to the sudden joy, I have to taste the pain of separation. I hated myself, and I hated Bruno 1,000 times more. I wondered if I had been rescued first that day, would a child that belonged forever to a different time and place safely enter the world? Would he have a spirited, rambunctious boy, or would her be a little girl who resembled me? I will never know, and I will never get the chance to know. That night, Bruno bellowed all night in the living room. In the morning I woke up to a floor full of cigarette butts downstairs and a divorce agreement he had signed. I signed the papers, rushed to the airport without looking back, into a future just for me. Training and studying happened daily and was very busy. By the time I got all settled down, half a year had passed. I caught up with old friends back home and got a bit of gossip. Maggie, you cannot imagine how terrible Camille's life has become post-divorce to stay out of trouble. I declared it on social media under the guise of the feelings have faded, returning to being friends. In adult life, we don't need to be too harsh. But Camille couldn't help but show and taunt. A gossip found out about her and Bruno. Neither were all friends as clueless and brainless as her clique. A lot of people were furious and defended me. Suddenly, their reputations lay in tatters. And just as Camille was on the verge of giving birth, the father of the child was identified. Again, a rich woman, and claimed Camille was a brazen mistress, and had them beat her until she aborted and bled profusely. Her doctor saved Camille's life, but in her last month of pregnancy there were days when it was touch and go whether she would survive. The baby was gone. It left permanent damage. She would be bedridden for life. She didn't even get a chance to gain justice. That rich bitch was just a cold bitch, sending the mentally ill to go at Camille Street style. A couple of health records allowed them to easily avoid prison. Bruno got snatched by the disciplinary committee in the middle of this ruckus and was sent off. He works now at some unremarkable clinic. No one knows where, no one talks to him. They say he's even more miserable and humiliated. None of this matters to me anymore. Heard about the gossip, I yawned and went back to studying. Then I didn't hear anything further from Homeland. In his normally cold eyes there was even an appeal. I did agree, but after waiting for 10 minutes, Bruno and his car were still nowhere in sight. I looked down, opened the ride-hailing app on my phone. 15 minutes later, I was safely home, sipping a warm cup of milk. The door opened again. Bruno showed up at the door, disheveled. He pursed his lips and met my eye maybe one last time. Margaret, why didn't you wait for me? Chapter 7. Why didn't I wait for him? Good question. Turning through the pages of the folder in my hands. I didn't look up. I did wait. You promised and were also late, but all it was more time, just a bit more. You went to visit Camille, no? I cut him off abruptly. Don't bother denying it. There's lipstick on your collar. The impression had been starved of subtlety. A blatant provocation. Camille had set the stage. It would be such a pity for her to not fulfill her plan. Millie suddenly fainted, and I was afraid she would get hurt. There was no mistaking Bruno's panicked expression. There is nothing between us, really. You misunderstood. His voice hoarse, his pain barely concealed, as though I had inflicted great pain upon him. But I was the one who was really suffering. I laughed in terrible pain and rage, the rage of those who spoke the Babylonian tongue and could not be ruined. You are aggrieved by something so trivial. But Bruno, the agony that you have put me through is so much deeper than this. When we got married, you gave me tears in the eyes of joy and you promised me to have my happiness for a whole life. You didn't even cry. But actually, all the suffering and shame I went through were brought by you. You gave me a ride 2 months ago when it was raining heavily. But we made it halfway, and Camille called and you dropped me on the side of the road. I got caught in the rain for a good 2 hours, caught a bacterial infection, and stayed in the hospital. On business trip a month back, I encountered a local riot. I was so scared. I flew the very first flight, 14 hours to be near you, looking for peace, only to see you with your arms wrapped around Camille. Remember that, singing her a birthday song a week ago. I bled heavily, pleading with you to save me, to save our baby. I was so desperate. And what did I get in return? You picked up Camille and stepped on the ambulance with no look back. Not even a word of concern. Were it not for the firefighters pulling me out just in time, I would have perished in that gasoline-soaked inferno with no chance to hear your petty grievances, as I seethed and clenched my fists. I started screaming at Bruno. Tell me, Bruno, complaints go where to me? Bruno was so stunned that his lips quivered like he was a puppet on a string, although no words escaped his mouth. I breathed deep, preparing to walk out, but all of a sudden Bruno was holding my wrist. Margaret, I was wrong. You are but a bastard. You can adamant, you can epitaph. But please, don't divorce me. I didn't know you were pregnant at the time of the car accident. I thought it was simply a slight injury. We can have more kids down the road. I'll take good care of you. Let me try and make it right. Please. I slapped back all my hate in response. Bruno, you're a real scumbag. I laughed bitterly, crying at the same time. So here you are, still haven't even looked at my medical records. You could have, and if you had you would know that when you deserted me, I was hemorrhaging badly. I suffered a cardiac arrest moments after they placed me on the operating table to save my life. Doctors had to replace almost all of my blood and even surgically remove my uterus. And now, hypocritically, you tell me we can have more kids. How am I supposed to create children with each of my acrimonious words? Bruno's expression became more frantic. By the end, he seemed completely wrecked. I laughed, pale as a sheet. If you really feel guilty, make sure you sign the divorce papers quickly and give me more money in the settlement. I don't care how Bruno reacts to these words, I am leaving. I went upstairs to rest. Chapter 8. But Bruno didn't seem to want to let up, no matter how many times I reminded him. Still, he would not sign the divorce papers. He began subsuming my everyday meals. Everywhere I went, he brought me a bouquet of fresh roses each morning. He was a shadow I could never outrun. After 2 or 3 of those, I could no longer handle it. Is this worthwhile, Bruno? Are you with me? My face was frigid, my voice very annoyed. You're disturbing my life. Are doctors so free these days? Bruno pursed his lips and smiled bitterly. I have been suspended from the hospital. An anonymous complaint was written accusing Bruno of having inappropriate relationships with patients. And he was in trouble himself for the favoritism he showed Camille at the hospital. But that was nothing compared to his investigation for not taking steps to save Linda. One mistake, and he would have effectively undone years of legal career with his years of tries. No, he could not fail. But I didn't care about any of this. Mingling his complex feeling with fake and forced smiling, Bruno smiled at my calm, untouched face now. I just want to be able to make it up to you. Okay, I can give you that opportunity. Really? Bruno's eyes briefly glowed with hope. The next moment he descended into despair. Sign the divorce papers. And I said, and coldly broke his illusions. If you won't, if I have been separated for 2 years, I can still file for divorce. I had once been love blind, and it hurt Musica. And now I had finally had a clear head. Nobody could prevent me from moving onward. Margaret, I know I hurt you a lot in the past, but I really understand what I did wrong. Are you not in a position to give me leeway? Bruno gazed at me vacant-eyed, choked with remorse. I looked at him apathetically. Can you return to me, my child? Chapter 9. After enduring the abortion. I had thought I was strong enough to endure this, yet every night in the middle of night, there was always child's cries repeating itself in my ears. I was tossing with nightmares night after night, soaking my pillow with tears. I told myself rationally over and over. It was the right decision to hide that baby. This child came too suddenly. My relationship with Bruno had no future. It would be unfair to him to come into a loveless family rashly. Furthermore, this child was lost in an accident, and I would not have to carry the guilt of killing him with my own hands. But the unrestrained sobbing was real. Those sleepless nights were real and many. And those dozens of contributions I made to temples for longevity lamps were not bogus either. In all my self-deception, I still couldn't forgive myself. As it sat like a large feather stuck in my throat, I knew what people were saying behind my back. I was an unfit mother, a horrible person, who had lost a life through my carelessness and hated myself for it. I needed to experience the pain of separation before I could embrace the sudden joy. I hated myself. I hated Bruno even more many times. I wondered how if I had gotten rescued first that day, with a child that was never going to be mine pushed through to safety in this world, would he have been a rambunctious, active boy or a little girl who resembled me? I can't say, and I'll never get the chance to say. Bruno spent the whole night standing in the living room. The next morning I woke up to cigarette butts all over the floor downstairs and a divorce agreement with his signature on it. I signed the papers and went to the airport immediately and entered into a future that was mine alone. It kept me very busy with daily training and studying. The time I had become fully settled down. Half a year had passed. I caught up with old friends back home and received an unexpected piece of gossip. Margaret, you'll be shocked to hear how miserable Camille is now that she's divorced out of respect for the dead. When the feelings faded, I announced it on social media. Returning to being friends. No need to unduly be wrought in adulting. But Camille could not help showing off and baiting. A busybody unearthing dirt about her and Bruno. Not all friends were as dumb as their shit friends. Many were outraged and defended me. All of a sudden, their reputations had been come crashing down. And just before Camille was to give birth, the father of the child was eventually identified. A rich lady stood up and accused Camille of being an unrepentant paramour who ordered her to be beaten until she had a miscarriage and bled copiously. During her last month of pregnancy, it was uncertain if she would survive, but the doctors saved Camille's life. The baby was gone. She is now bedridden for life, with permanent damage. It robbed her of even that opportunity for justice. And that rich woman was cruel, making use of mentally unbalanced people to come after Camille. A handful of medical records allowed them to slip through with little more than a slap on the wrist. Bruno was caught up in the chaos and was caught by the disciplinary committee who dismissed him. Nobody knows where he's working now, maybe as an assistant in some no-name clinic. His life is reportedly even worse and more humiliating, but none of that matters to me anymore. I inhaled the gossip, sipped my coffee, stretched and wandered back into the depths of my studies. After that, I never heard from Homeland again.